still need to finish discussing the implications for water required for sperm transfer in some of the land plants. And we'll talk about the vascular system before going on to the gymnosperms. So let's start with the evolutionary transition from water to land, specifically considering issues associated with the dependence of water for sexual reproduction that occurs in just the first land plants and also in green algae. And this is because sperm have to actually swim to the egg. We can see that with this as a visual backdrop. This is figure 3112 from your textbook and reminds you of the overall life cycle in all land plants. Again, review, just to remind you what we're talking about here. We've got a sporophyte here on the left of this diagram. This is the diploid multicellular stage. Sporophytes produce spores. Spores are shown up here at the top. They're released into the environment. They land. The cells start dividing and form multicellular organisms called gametophytes. Gametophytes generate or produce gametes. The gametes are sperm or eggs, and at this point, this is where water is required because, at least in the so-called seedless plants, water is required because it is in the seedless plants that the sperm swim to the egg. When the sperm swim to the egg, fertilization occurs. We then have a zygote. That is the single-celled or unicellular stage of the sporophyte. So after the zygote then continues to undergo cell division via mitosis, then you have production of a sporophyte. So this complete dependence on water for the sperm to swim to the egg then is something that we saw in green algae and we also see in the seedless plants. Now, it's important that when you hear the phrase seedless plants, you know what kind of plants that refers to. So I mulled over this phylogenetic tree here. This is figure 31-9 from your textbook, and this is a nice representation of the major plant groups, but I think one of the things that makes it difficult for a student to wrap their minds around this particular phylogeny is that there are a lot of other interesting but somewhat distracting side groups. So let's go ahead and simplify this to the relationship between the major groups here, meaning the green algae, the non-vascular plants, the seedless vascular plants, the gymnosperms, and the angiosperms. Okay, so I'm going to draw that as a phylogenetic tree on the right here. So here we go. Here we have the gymnosperms are a sister group to the angiosperms. So I've taken what is this entire orange branching monophyletic group, the gymnosperms, and I've collapsed it down to just one branch over on the right so you can see more clearly that that's a sister group to the angiosperms. And then we can go ahead and connect this up with the seedless vascular plants. This is a large group. They're still being revised. We're just going to collapse this down to one group as well. Same with the non-vascular plants. We're just removing any groups that we're not going to be discussing explicitly so that we can focus on the major relationships between the major groups. There we go. We end up with a nice, clear understanding, I hope, of the relationship between these 5 major groups, and then we can even put some examples on here. The few examples that will help you learn these groups and understand what these groups are. Let's see, non-vascular plants. We're not going to worry about the liverworts or the hornworts, but I told you that you're responsible for understanding that mosses are an example of a non-vascular plant. This will help it make it real to you, I hope. How about the ferns? The ferns are going to be our example of the seedless vascular plants. You're not responsible for knowing that whisk ferns or horsetails are also seedless vascular plants. Gymnosperms. Okay, oops, I'll do that in the wrong location. Let me get my eraser. So the gymnosperms, these are primarily the evergreen trees, such as pines, for example. We'll be discussing those today. And then the angiosperms, these are the flowering plants. Okay, so those are examples and the major groups that we'll be talking about. So I've written this out a little bit more nicely on this figure right here, so hopefully when you think about the major groups, you can just substitute something like this if this helps clarify the relationships for you. If in fact you're able to look at a diagram such as the one on the left, figure 31.9, and just simply ignore the distracting branches, that works too. But you do need to have clarity when something is stated such as seedless plants. So I go back here. Sperms swim to eggs in the seedless plants. What are the seedless plants? Well, if we go back to this particular group right here, these are the plants with seeds. So when we talk about seedless plants, that's mosses are seedless and ferns are seedless, okay? So in other words, when we talk about seedless plants, we're talking about the non-vascular plants and then the seedless vascular plants. So those are the mosses and then the ferns, and so we're going to go ahead and talk about them and their complete dependence on water for sperm to meet egg in reproduction in those two groups, and we're going to go in order, starting with the mosses. Okay, so let's consider the mosses first. We're going to walk through the moss life cycle. And this is shown for mosses specifically. It is typical for the other non-vascular plants. This is figure 31.13 from your textbook in front of you right now, shown in part. Now, one of the unusual things compared to many of the other plants is that the dominant stage is actually the gametophyte, the haploid stage, meaning if you look at a clump of moss, what you're looking at primarily is the gametophyte. It is physically the largest part. The sporophyte, the diploid part, is much smaller, and it is attached to the gametophyte. So if we go ahead and walk through the life cycle, starting with the sporophyte is shown here on the top, actually attached to the gametophyte. This will make more sense if we've gone through the entire life cycle. Being a sporophyte, of course, what does it do? Sporophytes produce spores. So off go the spores, they're blown in the wind, they land somewhere, and then they start to grow, the cells divide, you end up with multicellular gametophytes, which are shown in a more mature form over here on the right. So this is like an individual little piece of moss. Now, some mosses have distinct male and female individuals, such as shown here. Some, they're in the same individuals. So you don't need to really worry about that distinction, except that there are both male and female gametes produced in gametophytes, both sperm and eggs. Now, here's what students often find confusing about this particular diagram. So I want to alert you to this. The scientific illustrator is trying to take a little microscopic part of the diagram and move it over to the side, then magnify it so you can see what's going on. But of course, what confuses students is perhaps this is a different thing entirely. So what we're looking at over here, and I've circled in red the part where it says sperm swim to egg. Well, where are the sperm being produced? The sperm are being produced in specialized structures called antheridia. These antheridia are located right here at the top. I don't know if you could see these dotted lines here. I'm going to draw them in. So the scientific illustrator has taken what's a little microscopic speck on top of this mature male gametophyte and magnified it so you can see the details of what's going on. So the sperm being developed in little tiny structures right here. Those sperm have to swim to the egg. Where is the egg? Well, the eggs are developing in specialized structures called archegonia. And similarly, these dotted lines are supposed to represent that there's a little tiny structure right here on the female gametophyte, or the female part of the gametophyte, where the eggs are developing in little tiny microscopic structures. So this is just a magnified view of that little speck right there. So the sperm have to physically swim from this location to the egg, to that location. This requires that either the moss is underwater or that there's a thin film of water that they can swim to. The sperm, if it does in fact successfully swim to the egg, then of course it can fertilize it and one has a zygote. But the egg has not been released in the environment. The egg has been retained in the archegonia. So the egg is still located right here on top of the gametophyte. So as the zygote starts to grow then, here's a zygote growing inside this structure. It is growing right here. So this object right here is on top of the gametophyte, right? Which is, so this is just a magnified view of what's going on right here. This is why the sporophyte ends up growing out right on top of the gametophyte then, because this is where the retained egg was held. It then turns into a zygote. Once it's fertilized, it grows. It is not released, so it's physically attached as shown here. So the zygote is retained on the parent. This is really quite different. So here's a very short little clip of mosses just to remind you that they're small. They're underwater much of the time. Or if they're not underwater, they're at least in a moist habitat. They're being splashed by water. You're not going to have sperm moving from the antheridia to the archegonia unless there is a film of water or the mosses themselves are underwater. And they come in all sorts of different sizes and shapes as shown here, but they're all dependent on sperm swimming through water to get to the egg. And then here's another quick little few second movie here. Here's a typical clump of moss here, and you'll notice that if you take a bit of moss and pull it up, such as this hand has just done in this movie, notice that it's not attached via roots, okay? Roots are closely associated with a vascular system. Mosses are non-vascular plants. They don't have roots, so they have very superficial, much more limited connection with their environment. So, let's now consider the vascular plants that actually do have vascular systems. So again, we were talking about the mosses, which are the example of the non-vascular plants. We're back to figure 31.9. You can mentally substitute the simplified version if you want. We're now going to consider vascular plants, and they evolved from non-vascular plants, but much later. It's thought that about 60 million years elapsed between the appearance of the very first non-vascular plants, so mosses and their relatives, on the terrestrial surface before true vascular plants appeared. So 60 million years had gone by, so the planet the surface of the planet, the terrestrial landscape had changed completely. As you may recall, when the first land plants appeared on the surface, there was not much there. It was a pretty barren landscape. They were the first colonizers. But 60 million years has gone by. That's a really long time. By the time the vascular plants came along, the environment also included a lot of animals, such as insects and some of the early vertebrates, some of amphibians, for example. So the vascular plants then, and here's just a simplified version of this, is thought to have looked more like this. This is not a diagram from your book. This is from the National Geographic, showing an artist's impression of what this early landscape might have looked like, which is the Carboniferous period, several periods after the Cambrian. And no, you're not responsible for it, but you've probably heard that term before. I'm going to go ahead and use it, even though you don't have to know exactly. This is when the early vascular plants dominated the landscape, such as shown here. And for the first time, we now have really large plants. Why? Because the vascular system, in addition to allowing the transport of fluids around in the plant's body, from roots through shoots up to leaves, it also supplied mechanical support. The vascular system was a set of tubes that were stiff and strong and would allow the plants to reach heights that mosses are unable to attain in the absence of such stiffening structures. So it is pretty clear that there were vast expanses of vascular plants, giant ferns, a lot of plants that are very unfamiliar, and many of which are also extinct. And we know that they were very extensive in these swampy landscapes because of the vestiges that are left behind, primarily coal. Most of the coal deposits are in fact from the Carboniferous period, and most coal is in fact the organic molecules that were synthesized by these very early vascular plants, taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and making organic molecules out of them, which we now can burn to release the energy and then also release the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere again. So coal fossil fuel deposits are primarily these very early vascular plants, giant ferns and so on. So let's consider the vascular system. This is figure 31-8 from your textbook and shows some examples of the individual elements. Do not be concerned about the different names and the different types. Let's hit the important points here, which is that when we're talking about vascular systems in plants, we're primarily talking about hollow tubes through which fluid can flow. How are these tubes made? They're made by cells, plant cells, but they are dead at the point where they're conducting fluid flow, so they're hollow, there's no cytoplasm, there's just the remnants of the cell wall. And so cell walls are a really important structure in plant cells. They surround the plasma membrane. They're not found in animal cells, but they are found in plant cells. Do not worry about the differences between primary and secondary parts of the cell wall. That just refers to different areas within the cell wall, okay? So these cell walls then are made of two particularly interesting materials, cellulose and lignin. These are two of the main materials that make up the cell walls. These are extremely stiff, and they're very strong, and they're light. And so they're mechanically very good materials with which to make these hollow tubes, which then provide both a conduit through which fluids can be transported and also structural stiffening elements to allow a plant to extend up into the air. Okay. I think it's a little hard to visualize a vascular system just looking at these elements in isolation like this, and so here is a picture of a more realistic diagram of a vascular plant showing what the vascular system typically looks like in a plant. And so the vascular system is shown in red and extends all the way through from the roots at the bottom here up through the shoots and through the leaves. You can see all the red connecting elements of the vascular system as water is transported from roots throughout the plant, and then also as other fluids are transported around. You are not responsible for knowing xylem versus phloem, etc. in this course. If we consider an example of a seedless vascular plant, like a fern, which will be our example, we can walk through a life cycle for the ferns to see how they're different from the mosses that we've already learned about, and also how they're similar. This is figure 31-14 from your textbook in front of you right now, and shows the hopefully by now very familiar scenario of a sporophyte shown over here on the left, releasing spores. The spores then fall to the ground, develop into a gametophyte. The gametophyte generates gametes, sperm and eggs. Sperm swims to egg, creates a zygote. The zygote grows up into a sporophyte. But one of the things that's very different now about the seedless vascular plants, and in fact all the plants from now on, is the sporophyte is now the dominant stage. And so if we want to place this on one of our handy phylogenetic trees such as this, then this is a synapomorphy shared by all of the lineages downstream of this, so sporophyte is the dominant stage. For the seedless vascular and all the seeded plants and mosses, in contrast, the gametophyte is the dominant stage. Okay. And of course, what else can we put here at this point? Vascular system. Okay. Okay. Looks like the links were not working. Let's see. Are they going to work now? Oh, they are working. I am so happy. All right, ferns. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and jump down to the next one. Let's see. Let's go ahead and click on this one. Okay, I'll make it a little darker. So I think it's easier to, oh, poo. Is this one not, this one's not cooperating. What is it saying? Cannot something. Okay, we'll just jump out of here and grab it forcibly. Sure. Let's see. Sure. We'll go back over here. Let's check out. Let's see here. See if I can get it to cooperate. Yes. Okay, here we go. Here's the sporophyte. As mentioned in ferns, the sporophyte is the dominant stage. If you look at the undersurface of these fronds, you can see the locations where the spores are actually going to be produced. In these little structures here, you're absolutely not responsible for the names. There's a group of spores right there. When they're released, then they'll go out to the environment. So let's then jump to the next little movie clip that I grabbed and watch this. There they are. The spores are being released here. Let's see. Make this bigger. Afraid of making it mad. Oh dear, I made it mad. There we go. Okay, spores are being released. Can you see that? It kind of looks a little bit like rain. And as the spores fall, they're going to turn into the gametophyte. This entire movie is 12 minutes long, so I just grabbed chunks. There's the spore. See, the spores have been released by the sporophyte. There's a spore. And so it's now going to turn into a gametophyte, right? So here we go. Notice the sign that showed up for a second was hermaphrodite. That's because the gametophyte will be producing both sperm and eggs. There we go. We just had generation of the gametophyte. So this should look sort of familiar then from your movies. What was that? That was number 3. Close this down so I don't have too many open here. Let's go ahead and jump to number 4 here. There we are. Here's our gametophyte. Now what's going to happen? Let's see. If you look underneath. Uh-oh. Actually, I don't think we're ready for this. Let's go ahead. I think it's shown in a weird order. That's why I grabbed them in a different order. Yeah, that was the next part shown in the movie, but let's just go ignore that. Here we go. Here is, we're peering underneath the gametophyte now, right? So we're going to look at the structures. There's the antheridia. This is where the sperm are made, right? The antheridia is where the sperm are made. The archegonia where the eggs are made. So there should be some sperm in here. Let's see. Let's have a little peek here. There they are, right? There's the sperm in their little container. And there it is shown on the undersurface of the gametophyte. Yes, I don't think 12 minutes and 30 seconds is necessary to. Oh, looks like that one stopped. Okay, let's go ahead and head off to the next one then. Okay, so we're going to leave the antheridia here and go check out the archegonia. So we're zooming underneath the gametophyte here, looking for the archegonia. There they are. Ha. Archegonia is plural, archegonium is singular. So if we look in here, we should be able to see the egg, or ignoring all the other anatomical parts that we really don't need to be concerned about. There's the egg. It's right in there. Okay? In a structure we do not need to worry about its name. Okay, so there's the egg. Excellent. All right. So there it is in the structure. So the sperm have to leave the antheridia and make their way to the archegonia, to the egg in the archegonia. Okay, how does that happen? Let's go ahead and check out the next movie here. Let's see here. Now this is actually starting with looking at some actual real gametophytes, right? Oh, now we're back to animation. Okay, so here we are peeking underneath. Look, looks like we've got a little water here. Thank goodness, because if we don't have any water, we're not going to have any swimming. Okay, clearly there's water here. The sperm are swimming off. See, there they go. And there go the sperm. So here's all the different gametophytes of the fern. All right, so off go the sperm, and they're aided somewhat. Oh, there's the sperm. Yeah. Okay, there it goes. Now the sperm's progress is enhanced by release of chemical attractants from the archegonia. See, there it is. It's shown by the animator here as this little purple cloud. Those are supposed to represent chemical signal molecules that are being released. And so the sperm will respond positively to such chemicals and move towards the source that is emitting those. So here we go. The sperm has found the archegonia, right? I think this is, there it goes, right? There goes the sperm. A little artistic license, I think, here. Okay, here's the egg. Sperm, met egg. What do we have? Zygote, right? Sheesh, there we go, zygote. Okay, so now what happens? Okay, let's go back to fern, oh dear, what was that? Fern 4? It was sort of in a strange order. Let's see if this is, yes, here's where we left off. Okay, let's go ahead and play this one again. All right, so we now have this zygote, which is going to develop into what? The sporophyte, but it's still attached to the gametophyte, right? So notice it's not going anywhere. The gametophyte is still there, but this is now going to turn into the sporophyte. Okay, it's sort of slowly developing. It's a proper vascular plant, and so yes, it does have real roots and so on. Okay, let's see. It's got other parts. We don't need to worry about that. Okay, let's see. Okay, so here's the gametophyte, and then here is the sporophyte appearing and starting to develop. So this is what's going to be the dominant structure then. When you actually look at a fern, this is what you see. And look, there's a real thumb, right, pointing to what they look like in real life. So this gives you a good idea of just how small and nondescript the gametophytes are, so they're very easy to overlook. It is the, here we've got a little tiny developing sporophyte, but that's what will form the giant, gorgeous fern that you're more used to here. I think that's the end of the movie. Yes, it is. So here you have our little developing sporophyte. Okay, back to this. Okay, so we watched our animated version. I do think that makes it a little easier to understand the life cycle of a fern, to see it in an animated form like that. I think it makes the morphology a little clearer. Okay? As we learn about plants and the cycles, we're learning a lot of different parts, but hopefully some of them at least are very familiar to you now. And there are lots of small round objects that are dispersed in the environment. You really need to keep all of these straight. Okay, so let's do this as a quicker question. All responses count equally. I still would actually expect you to get this one right. Consider a small round object. Here's what you know about this small round object. It's dispersed in the environment. It has one cell. It's unicellular. It's haploid. It only has one copy of all the chromosomes. It's capable of developing directly into a multicellular form. What do you think this small round object is? Pollen, seed, spore, gamete? Do your best, click in. I'll give you 15 seconds or so. You might want to chat with your neighbor if you really have no idea. And then we'll see if you guys are up on your small round objects. Okay, everybody clicked in? Okay, looks like it's stabilized. Let's see this. Well, a disappointing 3/4. Sheesh. Okay. Well, for those of you who got that wrong, you might want to continue reviewing your sporophytes make spores. Spores grow up into gametophytes. Gametophytes make gametes. It's only the spores that are capable of developing directly into multicellular form. I'm delighted that 3/4 of you got it. I'm disappointed that the other 1/4 of you haven't quite got this yet, but hopefully you will get this soon. I do realize that in addition to a sort of astonishingly overwhelming number of different somewhat obscure taxonomic terms in this chapter, there are also a lot of botanical terms. And so to try to give you some relief to this, I will provide explicitly lists of terms that I expect to be able to use and that you know what they are: gametophyte, gamete, sporophyte, spores, and then now that we're going to be getting to seed plants, seeds, and seedless, and so on. All of these terms I'll be supplying in that document, the not responsible for document that I supplied earlier. I'll update it chapter by chapter, and all of these terms will appear in there. And then all the various terms you don't need to know too. I'll keep adding to this. You don't need to know your xylem from your phloem or all the plant parts or so on. Okay? So hopefully this will make it easier for you all. Okay. So, but certainly all of these 4 terms, I expect you to know these. So if we consider what's the difference between these, most of you got the difference between spores and gametes, right? Again, spores are haploid cells. They're produced by meiosis by the sporophyte, right? And they're capable of developing into a multicellular individual, namely the gametophyte, without fusing with another cell. Okay, and this is in complete contrast to a gamete, which is also a haploid cell, but it needs to fuse with another haploid cell. If it's egg, to fuse with sperm, sperm fuse with egg, to form a zygote, okay, which will then develop into the sporophyte. So we really need to keep these straight as you're learning about plants and the plant life cycles. How about these other 2 terms, pollen and seed? This is now a new innovation, which we're going to see with the evolution of the seed plants. And so we are now going to turn our attention to the gymnosperms, which is the first group of seed plants that we're going to be concerned with. So here's the gymnosperms right here. Right, there's two major groups of seeded plants, the gymnosperms, the angiosperms. We're going to talk with the gymnosperms. So seeds and pollen evolved in the lineage that led to the split between the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. The angiosperms are a far larger group, and we'll spend all of next time talking about the angiosperms. We'll just talk about the gymnosperms today. Gymnosperms, there are several different kinds. The most familiar are the so-called evergreen trees or Christmas trees or so on. They did arise about 40 million years after the first vascular plants. And they're quite common on campus. I brought some show and tell here. Let's see. Actually, let me cover one more point before I go into my show and tell. So one of the characteristics about seed plants that is different from the seedless plants that we have been learning about is that although they make spores just like all the other plants, they make more than one kind of spore. This is figure 31-16 from your textbook in front of you now, and it compares and contrasts the seedless plants in the top part of the diagram, which just make one kind of spore, basically, which typically, not always, but most of the time, generates gametophytes, which can be considered either hermaphroditic or bisexual, meaning that they produce both sperm and eggs. In contrast, the seed plants have different tissues that generate spores of different sizes. So we have so-called microsporangia making microspores. So obviously these are smaller than the megaspores that are generated by the megasporangia. At least the terms are relatively user-friendly. Microspores grow into male gametophytes, which make sperm, and megaspores grow up into female gametophytes, which make eggs. One of the things that makes this easier to remember is that, of course, sperm usually are much smaller than eggs. So sperm are generated by the microspores and eggs are generated by the megaspores, and you see this in all of the seed plants. So this is a life cycle for a gymnosperm. This is figure 31-18 from your textbook in front of you right now. And as we've seen with all the other land plants, when we've gone through their life cycles, you see over on the left here, we're starting with a sporophyte. But now, because we're talking about gymnosperms, we have this great big old evergreen tree, which is a typical gymnosperm, over on the left as our representative sporophyte. And now, because this is a seed plant where is a seed plant where we no longer have just one kind of spore-producing structure, we have two different kinds of structures here producing the spores. So we have cones of two different kinds. And I thought this would maybe be easier for you to understand if I just showed you what these look like. So as you walk around campus, you'll see things that look like this from all the evergreen trees on campus. These are examples of the cones that produce the microspores. These are, or you can call these male cones, and they look quite different in appearance. So these are what produce the pollen. And these are the so-called female cones, very different in appearance, shown here. And then, of course, the evergreen trees can be recognized by their needle-like leaves, very characteristic, as shown here. Okay, so if we go back to this diagram then, the cones that I was showing you, I showed you a male cone that looked like this, and a female cone that looked like this. And so the male cones then produce microspores. The microspores grow into pollen grains, and what's completely different then about the seed plants is that the pollen grains are actually male gametophytes. So no longer do you have so they're microscopic and they blow through the air. There's absolutely no more dependence on water for the sperm swimming through the water to reach the egg, because the male gametophytes have taken to the air. Most of the gymnosperms are in fact wind pollinated, so the pollen blows through the air and lands where? Well, it is going to have any chance of meeting up with an egg. It has to actually land on the cone of the same, female cone of the same species as shown down here in the sort of middle part of this diagram. Here we have a female cone, and if you look up more closely at the female cone, you see these individual scales, which are the parts that separate on the cone. And so the male pollen grain then has to fly in, has to be wafted through the air, actually land on the surface of the female cone. If that happens, then a little tiny structure called a pollen tube, here's the term right here, grows from the pollen grain to the egg, and that's where the sperm travels. So there's no more swimming through a water film. So much less dependence on water for the transport of sperm. And this allowed the gymnosperms then to live in areas which are much drier than could be colonized by the ferns or the mosses, which were completely dependent on films of water for the sperm to swim to the egg. We now have a situation where there is no direct water dependence for that. Okay. So if once the sperm actually reached the egg, then what happens? We still have fertilization, we still have a zygote forming into a sporophyte, but this now takes place within a new structure called a seed. So we have two new structures now in the seed plants. We've got the pollen grains, which are basically the male gametophytes, and we've got the seeds. So the seeds contain the developing embryo and some nourishing tissue and a protective coating, and then the seeds can either be dispersed by air or by animals. So let's go back to the real thing here on the document camera. Let's see if we can, where's my forceps? Here we go. Okay, so how would this work in real life, right? Here's the male cones, we have some wind, right? Right? The pollen, the male gametophyte, right? And so in about a month, you're gonna see yellow powder everywhere from these guys, right? Any of you who are allergy sufferers are very acutely aware of the pollen everywhere. But anyway, the pollen moves through the air until what? It reaches the female cone. Here it is, right? So it just blows in here, and then these scales, which in this particular cone are separated. They're separated when the cone is receptive to the male gametophyte landing in there, and then the scales close up and then open again once the developing seed is ready to be released. And so you can actually find seeds in here. Let's see, I thought I saw it in there earlier. It fall out of my bag. Let's see. No. Sheesh. Oh, there's one. I think. Broke it. Oh. All right. Let's see here. Ah, is this one? Ta-da! Well, it's broken, but here. I think it fell. There you go. There's some more debris from my bag. Yes, looks like they all fell out, actually. These should look familiar to you, right? These are winged seeds here. So there's the seed right there. A bit small. Let's see. There we go. Now we can see it. All right? So there's the seed, and then this bit of a wing. So you see these falling, and they often look like little helicopters. Right? Okay. So a huge change then, with the gymnosperms no longer being dependent on water for transport of sperm. The pollen grains, the male gametophytes, fly through the air to land on the female cones. And yes, I already covered the two different kinds of heterospory. And I also already covered this point here. So now let's turn our attention to the structure of the seed that is then released when the cones open, after the seeds are ready for releasing. If you look at the structure of a seed, then you see the embryo inside. So this is the embryo that is what? The multicellular developing form of that zygote, right? When the sperm fertilized the egg. This is what will turn into the sporophyte. So the seeds then can be dispersed. They're no longer growing attached to the gametophyte as they were in the mosses and the ferns, but they are packaged. I think that's shown well here in this diagram from your book, that the seeds have nutrients packed in them for the embryo starting to fuel the original initial cell divisions of the developing embryo. And then it's also in a protective coating as shown here. So if we go back to this question, what's the difference between these four? We already discussed spore and gametes, and now we've brought in pollen and seeds, right? So pollen then are the microscopic male gametophytes, and depending on gymnosperms, they're almost all wind pollinated, so they're dispersed through the air. They have to land on female cones then if they're in order for the sperm to reach the egg. If a zygote, in fact, is formed then, this is packaged into a seed with nutritious tissue. It's surrounded by a tough coating, and then this can land and develop into a sporophyte, and independent of the location of the original gametophyte. So it should be clear to you, I think, from going through the life history of the gymnosperms, why the changes in the life history that enabled the gymnosperms to spread through habitats that were inaccessible to the earlier plants. So this is actually where I stopped in the earlier section, so I'm going to go ahead and stop, even though I have 5 more minutes here. I'll go ahead and release you. I'll see some of you perhaps before, otherwise I'll see you on Wednesday.